Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bruce Lynn. I'm one of the managing partners of the Financial Executives Consulting Group. Today, we're bringing you the webinar, How Should Treasury Measure Its Success in Today's Environment and a Post-COVID-19 World? The webinar is presented by the Financial Executives Networking Group and Team Annie, which is now has its New York as well as Westchester, Connecticut group, formerly Connecticut AFP. So together, we're going to explore Treasury's new world, and I want to make sure that everybody has enough time to log on. We've got quite a large crowd coming in. So I just want to make some administrative announcements, then I'm going to go away and come back in about a minute or so, and then we'll start. For those of you who have logged on, you are in mute-only mode, which means that you can hear me, but I can't hear you. We do have a formal presentation. We have a panel that will discuss some of the issues. But if you do have questions on your own, please type them into the question box on the lower right-hand side of your screen, and we'll get to them online. If there are questions that are specific to your company or you want them to remain confidential, please send me an email offline, and we'll obviously have myself or one of the panelists get back to you, and we'll take it offline. With a large number of people, I suspect we will not be able to get to all the questions in the roughly 1 hour that will be here. So don't worry, if you type your questions in, we will get to you offline. So with that, I'm going to go away for about a minute, let people log on, and we'll start in another minute or so. Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who have just joined, my name is Bruce Lynn. I'm one of the managing partners of the Financial Executives Consulting Group. We have a webinar today, How Should Treasury Measure Its Success in Today's Environment and a Post-COVID-19 World? The webinar is brought to you by the Financial Executives Networking Group and Team Annie, the Treasury Management Association of New York, and one of its new recent affiliates, the Connecticut AFP. For those of you who are in Treasury, these two groups encompass pretty much the Metro New York area. And for those people who are interested in all things Treasury, if you're not a member, you certainly should join. An administrative note, you are in mute-only mode, which means that I can hear you. I'm sorry, you can hear me, but I can't hear you. We have a formal presentation. If you have questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box on the lower right-hand side of your screen, and we'll get to them hopefully before the hour is up. If we don't, or if there are questions that are of a confidential nature, send me an email and we will take them offline. You will have access to the recording later on. We do have some polls here, so the recording will have the polls and the results, and people will get copies of the slides in about 48 hours. So with that, let's get started. Okay, we have a panel moderated by myself, and here are some very brief bios, but now what I'd like to do is just to turn this over to the panelists who in turn will introduce themselves. So Seth, why don't you start first, please?
Sure, thanks, Bruce. Welcome, everyone. I'm Seth Marlowe. I'm a strategist with the Strategic Advisory Group, which is part of Treasury Management at Wells Fargo. And I've been with Wells for about 10 years, and I'm a former Treasury practitioner. Even held the title of treasurer once upon a time at the Danone Waters business, the Evian and Danone Water business in Connecticut. And glad to be here with this very esteemed panel.
And this is Kristen. Yeah, sure. It is Kristen Michaud, Managing Director for a product called InBlock as part of a fintech in New York City, LiquidX. We specialize in working capital management in the monetization of those assets. I have over 20 years of experience in Treasury, spent 10 years at General Electric and 10 years prior to that on the technology side at IBM. Super passionate about digital treasury, operations, working capital, and excited about this panel.
Hi, my name is Marguerite Versace. I am the Assistant Treasurer at Tronox, which is a vertically integrated producer of titanium dioxide and inorganic chemicals. We're headquartered in Stamford, Connecticut. In 2019, our revenue was $2.6 billion. The company mines and produces titanium ore, zircon, and other minerals. It manufactures titanium dioxide pigment, which adds brightness and durability to paints, plastic, paper, and many other products. We have operations all over the world, including United States, Australia, Europe, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, China. I am personally accountable for Treasury operations, which includes Treasury policy, governance, controls, which includes cash management, bank account organization, cash flow monitoring, and electronic banking. In addition, I'm also Vice President of the Team Manny chapter for Connecticut, and I'm also CTP certified. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And as you see, we have a panel that has different perspectives on what Treasury is, what they should be doing, where they should be going. Basically, we have a banker, a fintech company, and of course, a multinational company. Myself, I have a wide variety of backgrounds, including banking, as well as corporate treasury. So in the next hour or so, we hope to give you a perspective that is not just Treasury, but Treasury in relation to the company, the markets, and so on. So the agenda here is pretty straightforward. Talk about a little bit about COVID-19, what we think the new normal will be for Treasury, and then how you get from here to there, building a business case for change. Now, you can build it, but the idea here is a good plan well executed is what we really want to do. So how to make it happen? It helps if you know where you are. And so measuring success is also part of making it happen. And then we will have some time for Q&A, and hopefully we will get to all the questions. So let's start off here. Again, this is to make sure that under the rules of the CTP process, that we actually look at and make sure that, quite frankly, that you are paying attention here. So we're going to ask, just to get a real feeling for what's going on, where everybody is. We've got a great number of people on the line here. So just as a sort of a stake in the sand, the question is, how prepared do you really perceive your company to be for something as a disaster recovery or business continuity type event? I mean, arguably no one knew about COVID-19 about 2 months ago, but again, a disaster is a disaster is a disaster. So let me do this. So I'm going to launch a poll here. I'm going to keep it open for about a minute or so, and I would be appreciative if people start answering that. Again, we don't want to hold things up, so I'll give people about another 60 seconds or so, and then I'm going to close the poll and ask the panel to discuss some of the results. Okay, about another 10, 15 seconds. I can see that some of you out there aren't voting. I have secret powers I'm watching here. All right, another couple of seconds. Remember, this is for posterity. Okay, I'm going to close the poll in 3, 2, 1. All right, let me close the poll here, and then I want to share the results. So now everybody should be able to see the results. And so here we go. Very interesting results here. So let's have the panel comment here. Seth, we're going to start with you first. What do you think of these results?
I was fully expecting the somewhat prepared to be the high water mark. And I think a large part of that is most organizations have gone through the exercise, whether it was SOX related or other requirements of their organization to have a BCP plan. I think the biggest differential that puts this into the somewhat is that I think most assumptions about DR or BCP is short term, that it may be a day or 2 or 3, and then you're sort of pushing your luck. And so the extended circumstances that we're in, I don't think anyone realistically planned for, and that's why I think we're seeing the 41% sitting right smack in the middle.
Kristen, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm a little surprised and relieved for those that were in the fully prepared bucket. I know that in my prior role, we were doing a lot of work to prepare for this, and at my current company, we were somewhat prepared, but I don't think anybody really had projected the magnitude of the impact of COVID on our existing operations. And so while we had a lot of SOPs and capabilities in place, we were still moving on the fly, as I would call it, as we were going. And then I would say to those that are in the not prepared bucket, a great opportunity. There's tons of literature out there on kind of some basics, like Seth says, around how to just do kind of the basic preparedness activities, which I'm sure you're looking at.
Marguerite, what do you think here about these results?
Sure. So I think they're in line with what I was expecting. I can personally say I would have voted myself, my company, for the well-prepared. Even though we documented everything, processes are always changing. So as we, and we had a coworker become ill with COVID, so we had to whip out our plans. And even with our well-prepared plans, things were still not quite fully documented. So I can see that. Thank you.
Well, it's true, I think, of most plans. As they say in the military, plans tend to collapse at the first attack of the enemy. So here you go with a plan, and I'm sure that the 41% who were somewhat prepared probably thought they were well prepared. The future is unknowable, so I think these results, I quite frankly am surprised at 32%, or actually more when you get the fully prepared in there, that 38% of the people were either well or fully prepared. I quite frankly think that's great. So let me take that down, and let's continue on here, because we do have a few more things to talk about. Now, that is the audience, obviously. Now, here's another survey. This was done by Ernst & Young in March of this year, and slightly different questions, but really the same thing about how the CFO sees their environment in a COVID-19 world. And I think the interesting thing here is that you see a vast majority, I'm looking at sort of the bottom up here, 72% are really conducting more frequent, strategic and portfolio reviews. I think this is, again, what these kinds of inflection points mean to a business. So you just can't stop and hide in a hole. You've got to understand where you're going and see if you can move on. So again, for those in the audience, it gives you just an idea of what a CFO might look at and think is important. Transformation programs, again, sort of keep moving is one of the attributes here. To me, the surprising thing was over half of the people still expecting to plan and pursue acquisitions in the next 12 months. I found that to be a little surprising. Any thoughts from the audience? I'm sorry, from the panel about their comments about this chart?
Well, I'm not surprised about the thoughts for M&A activity. I think if companies had already had that in mind, now with a discount in the market, you could say I could see activity occurring.
I think the next thing to think about is not only what you see internally, what the CFO expects, but you talk to your partner, and I mean bank, and what are the banks looking at? And this to me was a little surprising. This is from Bloomberg. And again, this is a 6-week period, roughly, from middle of March to sort of the end of April. And the banks, interesting enough, are looking at a lot of their customers, good customers, bad customers, I can't tell, but they're looking at companies that are really drawing down under their revolvers because they need liquidity. And in a normal environment, just-in-time liquidity, oh, I'll get the money tomorrow. Doesn't seem to really be what's happening here. Companies are drawing down literally hundreds or tens of billions of dollars. To me, the most amazing thing is the brown portion of this graph, in which the banks are saying, well, that's all nice, but let's talk about new facilities, new loans, and oh, if we're going to do that, let's talk about new covenants, anti-cash hoarding, LIBOR floors. I mean, LIBOR floors, mandatory repayments, those aren't really new. Last seen maybe a la 2008. But I've not seen anti-cash hoarding covenants. Panel, let's start with Marguerite. I don't want to keep, poking Seth all the time, but Marguerite, what would be your reaction to this kind of bank perspective?
Sure. So I'm not surprised now in the COVID-19 world where companies might have drawn down on their revolvers, probably just to be super cautious, because I think we were all around in 2008, and when the market started to dry up and with the uncertainty of COVID, I think companies, cash is king and you want the cash in your account. Thanks.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That in 2008, while it's 12 years ago, for some people that still it made a lasting impression. So being that there was such a liquidity crunch back then, I think a lot of organizations and a lot of CFOs and treasurers looked at this and said, hey, I need to make sure that I'm not going to be cash strapped. Let me do what I can to make sure that I've got the cash, and I'd rather have it sitting in my bank account than sitting in an untapped revolver. Let me tap it, let me have it. And that's certainly what we've seen. And one of the big four banks certainly said something that their deposit inflows had been so large that in fact it looked almost as if they had bought another bank that might have been in the top 5 to 10 category. So that gives you a sense as to how huge the resulting deposits were from all of this.
Well, it's again, obviously it depends on the industries. I mean, General Motors has made some big news about drawing down, I think, about $16 billion under their revolvers, and I haven't heard anything about Apple or Microsoft. Both of these companies have literally hundreds of billions of dollars of cash on their balance sheet already. I sincerely doubt that they are in the blue part of this graph. So the high-tech industries, maybe not so much. Car companies, Boeing, other names. I mean, you can read about these in the various newspapers about who's drawing down. But again, I think what the issue here is liquidity now is really going to be as important as maybe market share or EBITDA. So again, this is where Treasury now has to think about some issues that they don't normally face. So let's just talk about how, again, the people in the audience look at these COVID-19 events, and for the people in the audience, what have they seen as being most impacted? So let me launch this poll here. And then if people can look at that, and again, this is a multiple choice, so you can do more than one here. And curious to see how people think about people, training, skill levels, obviously processes, executing payments, banking relationships, use of technology, and then obviously the external issues about customers and vendors and how that impacts people's businesses. Okay, about 45 seconds have gone by. I want to give it another few seconds here. And let me start to close this here. In 3, 2, 1, close that. And let me share the results here. Okay, let's say panel, what do you think? And let's start with Kristen here. What do you think of these results?
Sure. Yeah, I'm not surprised. It seems like it's all of the above. And that's consistent with what we've seen. One of the things I was going to comment on the prior slide is, you know, a lot of the reasons that we're seeing some of our clients draw down is because the historical analysis or you think about the customers and the vendors and the assumptions around those processes have changed as well. So there's not that historical data that can be used to kind of predict what's going on with the COVID events. And so just from, you know, people, I'll hit each of these real quick, but like from a people perspective, you know, just overly communicating, reaching out to colleagues, making sure people feel connected, the technology, you know, depending on how familiar folks are in the tech industry, I can imagine that being simpler for folks, but there are a lot of folks that aren't used to getting on Zoom calls or webinars and, you know, even telling, you know, VPNing into their, you know, company's network have been challenging, right? And then you think about really understanding what your customers and your vendors are going through and how do you support them. So I could see these all being equally important.
Marguerite, what do you think about the results here?
Sure. So quickly, I agree with everything that Kristen had just said. You know, personally, we were already working remote on Fridays. So from a technology standpoint, I think we were all in a good standpoint. But I agree from the people and the process. So, you know, you talk to your coworkers when you're in the office, and now that we're remote, you know, one of my key things that I've said to everybody I work with is communicate, and then over communicate, right? Because we don't have the coffee talk. I'm not seeing you in the hall. So with that, I think, you know, just communication can always be a challenge. Thanks.
Thank you. And Seth, what you know, what do you see? You've been on both sides of the fence here.
Yeah, I think the process one, which of course is the highest ranked one, you know, is probably one that you know ties in with the BCP preparedness, because I think to the extent that people either had plans or even without plans, you may still have had standard operating procedures that were documented, but you know, when was the last time you went back and actually updated them? And now, you know, the process may be a little different than the last time it was updated, and tie in the people component. You know, as Marguerite said, you know, she had someone who got sick. Hey, look, I was out sick for 3 weeks myself with this thing. But you have people that are doing process work, and then you have someone who's in a backup role, or maybe hasn't even been in a backup role, and suddenly has to do something that they've either done very little or have never done before. So those procedures had best be really up to date and valuable. So I think that's where people struggled. And to me, that's a lot of the, especially at the beginning, the kind of the keeping the lights on as #1 priority. And, you know, now that we're further along, I think it opens the door for, you know, lessons learned, how do we move forward, and so on. So, and I'll just touch on the technology piece. I know certainly, you know, even at the bank, there have been, you know, certain groups that, you know, typically never worked from home. They were always in the office. You know, there was a huge push to get people laptops and get laptops imaged, and to get people VPN, and to ensure that there was proper bandwidth for for this new normal that we're all in. So, technology's played, I think, a huge key in, in some of the challenges that are out there.
Yeah, I would say that to me, the surprising thing actually is that customers are sort of ranked as highly as they are. I mean, obviously, people and process and technology is something that is relatively controllable within the company. Customers, of course, are outside the company. So the fact that customers are people too, I guess is another way to look at it. So that companies that are, concerned about liquidity have to realize that it's as much about the people outside the company as it is inside the company. And again, technology was a little lower than I expected. At the end of the day, I think it's good people are really what's going to make the company rise to the challenge. Well, let's hide this.
I was going to say, you can go ahead and switch slides, Bruce. My thought on the customer piece, I just have a sneaking suspicion that we may have more than our fair share of bankers and other software providers and others that may be joining us today. And so that may actually be somewhat different as from that perspective of bank or vendor that are working with their customers to have moved that number up. So just thought on that.
Sure. And this slide here talks about the new normal, and this is a little bit more detail to back up the poll that we did. So again, it's difficult to say exactly what the new normal looks like because again, companies have a culture, industries are different. But I think then when you look at people, process, and technology, that's sort of a good way to look at the issues that have to be resolved. They're related too. I mean, it's nice to look at this chart and go, oh, look, we can draw lines, but that's not the way it works. There's a natural flow to any situation in a company. So these are things that if you want to make a checklist, okay, that's good, but you have to realize that it is related, and as we saw from the other slide, is that customers and even vendors are certainly part of this. So I want to move on here because we do have some discussion questions, and I think this is a good place to start really a discussion with our panel here because each brings a different perspective. So here are some challenges, and obviously this is by no means a complete list, but here are some of the challenges that the treasurer or treasury would want to look at. So let's just start again from the top, maybe with Seth. Would you like to sort of talk about these challenges and how the treasurer might want to look at these in a holistic view?
Well, probably the first thing that I'd like to just put out there is probably the last of the bullets, which we're at an unprecedented time of fraud and cyber risk. And frankly, the fraudsters are out there in full force. We're seeing every imaginable kind of fraud threat that's coming in, whether it's phishing, ransomware, account takeover, business email compromise. They're just kind of waiting for an opportunity like this where people are not in their regular rhythms and maybe pushed into doing things that they don't do every day. So that's, I know, a huge concern. Number of treasurers and treasury directors I've spoken to recently have actually seen a huge uptick, particularly in the BEC or business email compromise arena. And, it's making sure that people continue to be as vigilant as ever to make sure that they're not tricked into moving money or getting documents shared that shouldn't be. And interestingly, even as we've moved to the world of webinars, webcasting, Zooming, and so on, I think there have been risks identified there as well of you don't know what necessarily someone that's invited to a meeting is going to do knowingly or unknowingly. So it's a much riskier world today than it was 6 to 8 to 10 weeks ago.
Kristen, Kristen, would you like to comment on some of these bullet points here?
Sure. Yeah, I'd say that, the one that sits kind of front and center for me is just if you haven't invested in the automation and the modeling and the scenario planning for cash forecasting, just that constant iteration and cycle time around the new analysis there. All of your upstream and downstream assumptions have changed. And to be able to do your day job, like Marguerite mentioned, and maybe be covering somebody else's job that you weren't planning to cover. And then on top of that, be asked to do a constant churn on data without the digital and automation. That's kind of the biggest one I've seen in the frustration. And I think it goes without saying, you're doing all that on top of what we saw in the prior chart, which is for those with young kids, balancing being the caregiver plus your full-time job, dealing with maybe parents that are ill and can't travel and get food. Like there are all these macro elements going on while you're kind of knee deep in this space as well.
If I can jump in for a second. Sorry, Bruce. I was talking to a customer yesterday who is, telling me that they had a fairly sophisticated forecasting system, and I said, well, are you doing this on Excel or is it on a BI package? And it was, and he said that in fact what they've had to do because of the changes in the business is that they literally, rather than trying to reconfigure the automation and the dashboards they put in place, they literally went back to the drawing board to try to start modeling this from scratch and back to Excel, figuring let's get to a new stable, and then once we've stabilized that, then they'll bring it back into their BI platform to continue seemingly where they left off.
Marguerite, would care to comment on some of these challenges?
Sure. So I agree with everything that the other panelists were saying. In addition, I agree we too have been challenged with being asked to provide a cash flow forecast, which we've done. And now it's, you work internally and you're asking, well, what's the new numbers? And nobody's willing to commit. So that's been certainly a challenge. Luckily, we had kept up good relationships with our relationship banks. So we actually were one of the companies that, drew on our revolvers. And so that wasn't really a problem for us. But now I was stuck with all this money, and now I'm quickly figuring out where am I going to invest it and making sure that I comply with the policy, and now we're actually repaying it and we're taking out a bond. So, I mean, gosh, I've been busier now than I've ever been before. So that's been challenging for me.
I think you bring up an interesting point, and that's the note at the bottom here, that given these kinds of disasters, you can get wrapped up in the trees and lose the forest. So Treasury, I think, does have an opportunity to become strategic, but there are all these tactical things that you have to do. So, can you plan and execute at the same time? There have been many discussions over time about why Treasury wants to be strategic, and that is something that has been ongoing. For example, here is a survey that the AFP did back in 2017, back in the old days, in which they asked the people about whether their Treasury departments actually were strategic. Again, this is 3 years ago. Things were calmer then. We certainly were far enough away from 2008, so that should have been a lingering effect. And yet, look, when you look at the chart, you look at the smallest number of people who actually consider their Treasury to be strategic. And yet Treasury has certainly been around for a while. So you're saying to yourself, is Treasury really moving forward? Can it handle the challenges that we just explored on the previous slide? Now, this is 2017, and so maybe things have developed since then. And so, okay, panel, let's ask the panel and actually the people in the audience about what they think. I mean, since then, have they become maybe more strategic? So here is another poll, and we're asking the question, where is your treasury on the maturity spectrum? Strategic, enhancing, established or developing, foundational. Again, same definitions as we just used. So if people would vote, it'd be interesting to see whether people have been able to become more strategic, because I think, as the panel has sort of explained, this is going to be necessary to meet the new challenges. Okay, a few more seconds. And get a few more people to vote here. You got to remember, this is all part of the CTP process. Although I think it's also good information to understand where you are in relation to others. Okay, I'm going to cut this off in 3, 2, 1, and let me share this with everyone. So here we are. So I think this is interesting. So let me start with the bottom of the alphabet. So Marguerite, unfortunately, that's you. So what do you think of the results of this survey?
Sure. So I think this is interesting. I think that I'm surprised that actually strategic was even selected. I think people think they're better than what they are. Personally, I think for personally me speaking, enhancing is probably where I would be as a company with our treasurer and treasury team. And so the reason why I say that is because I think there's always room for improvement. I think that certainly during the case of the COVID-19 and when we decided to, withdraw on our RCFs and then, take out a bond, I think Treasury really provided some wonderful opportunities for the company to take. So in summary, I think that I think developing and establish would probably be where majority of companies are. Thanks.
And Kristen, what do you think of these results?
Sure. Yeah, I'm actually not surprised by the strategic. Where I came from, I had left GE in January to pursue this fintech opportunity, but GE's treasury is, they sit in a very strategic position, seat at the table, kind of right hand to the CFO, and so I'm not as surprised by that score, and I've seen that with our customers that we work with today at my current company. I will say kind of the one piece that I think comes out of this is that, to be in Treasury is a unique space. It takes a blend of a very, finance skill set, quantitative skill set, and sometimes treasuries are considered kind of black holes to the rest of the organization. And so I think to where Bruce was saying, it's an opportunity, if you do sit in the foundational, developing, established part of the organization, to keep sharing what you do, speaking in normal finance terms so that people understand the value, and then using that data that you have in Treasury, because you're kind of the downstream in some ways part of the process, to actually help other key strategic decision makers in the company, which makes you more strategic.
Thank you. And Seth, what's your feeling here about the results?
I guess the one thing that no one's talked about yet is the foundational side, which I think is far higher than what was in the 2017 E&Y study. And I think a lot of that may be the nature of, perhaps some smaller sized enterprises. I mean, what I've typically seen is, as you go further down from, multinational into middle market and then below, we start to see treasuries where there isn't necessarily a treasury function, but people in finance or accounting who are doing Treasury functions, individually Treasury processes. And that's where I typically see companies that are at that foundational stage. I wasn't expecting 14% though. I imagine that the foundational and developing, that combination 37%, is also representative of folks that may have had more than their fair share of change management and issues to deal with as it relates to this pandemic and reacting to it. So some interesting numbers coming out of this.
Well, I think that's an interesting point. I was just going back here. Let me do this. I'm going to take this slide off here. But if you remember from the previous slide, well, let me just say 33% of the people said they were enhancing their treasury. And interesting enough, when you go back to the previous slide, that is certainly double what the 2017 results are. But to Seth's point, the same thing with the foundational, much higher in our webinar survey, 14%, than it was in the AFP survey. Now, obviously, I don't know if the two groups are exactly comparable from a demographic standpoint, but there are some order of magnitude differences. And so I think, Seth, you picked up something about, whether there are more people who are still maybe stuck on the foundational side. I guess being ever the optimist, I would say, well, this is great. There are more people who are really enhancing their treasury or are in the enhanced treasury portion than there were back in 2017. And yet still, just to be narrow-minded here, the strategic treasury still seems to be an aspirational goal. We have in our survey, I think 11% said they were strategic or optimized. And here, I'm just looking at the blue bar. Here, it was 12%. So the challenges that Treasury is going to face are out there. Treasury, again, may be well prepared, but perhaps not where it should be. Could be a takeaway that I would see. So let's roll forward here. We did that one. Okay, so now we're just going to talk a little bit more about sort of maybe how we get to that nirvana, to that optimized strategic treasury. And a question I would throw out to the panel here, do other functions within the company, do they view treasury as a partner? And so, Seth, I'd like to start with you about that, because you have, I think, both an inside and outside look, being treasury and banking.
Yeah, partnership's a funny thing. And I think the way I would sum it up is it takes two to tango. Oftentimes we see organizations that have got silos, and the ones that seem to do the best job at bridging those silos are ones where they have people who do something that I like to refer to as internal networking. And there's a concept we're all familiar with, the know your customer. I almost turn that around internally. Know your own company. How much, if you're in Treasury, how much do you know about what really goes on in tax and accounting, FP&A? How much of a partnership have you forged with your IT team? And does your IT team know significant amounts about your business and the way you operate on a day-to-day basis in any of these functions? Companies and people that tend to have more of this, it's almost a touchy-feely side to things, I think, are ones that do a much better job of partnering. It's not necessarily something that can be forced on you. But it takes a lot of effort and usually different kinds of leaders to be able to make some of these things happen.
Okay, and Kristen, what's your thoughts here about partnerships?
Yeah, I know. Interesting. I completely agree with what Seth said around, underestimating the amount of internal networking. I think that's a good takeaway for a lot of folks' early career as well, because I think sometimes your head's down working on things. I think as you think about partnerships, those relationships that you build, whether it's early career or in your current job, And it's got to be twofold. It's got to be you sharing what you do and then being curious enough and wanting to learn enough about what the other person is working on. And then the last piece I would just say is don't underestimate the value of shared data. So, you know, in different roles and in my current role, we expose a lot of the data that we see. And a lot of times that data is not visible to your partners, whether, you know, to Bruce, your point in tax or FP&A or even sourcing operations, if you think about working capital, right? And I think showing that data in a way that you're not being confrontational, but sharing that data to help bridge a gap in understanding creates a shared metric, right? And a lot of times those shared metrics is how you really get key wins out of operations in other areas. So that would be my recommendation.
Marguerite, what's your thought about partnerships?
Sure. So I personally believe in internal networking as well, and I do that through lunches. So everybody's got to eat lunch. So I'm always doing these lunch roulettes. I invite 2 other people. We go down to the cafeteria and we just talk about work or anything personal. But when we talk about work, usually I open it up. What are you working on? And I often find they're doing something that might be beneficial to me. So, you know, just showing value of what they do and value of what I do, I find that leads to some really nice outcomes in the long term.
Great. Well, let's take a look maybe at another issue here. We talked about partnerships, and obviously there's sort of an agreement that partnerships are important. The question, though, is maybe another question sort of related, is that you have a partner, and so what kind of support do you need to move into that modern or strategic treasury? And again, I'm going to just start from the bottom of the alphabet again. So, Marguerite, in terms of support, is it external? Is it internal? What kind of support do we need on?
Well, I think it's always both, right? So it depends what your goal or project is. So I use my bankers all the time just to benchmark. I like to hear what other people are doing, and then I also use my external groups like the Team Manny group. I'll reach out to some people in the group, just asking them what they do at their company for guidance. And then internally, when I start to present my idea, I'm like, well, I just heard from XYZ company, this is how they do it, or my banker. And then internally, you know, you can't act in a silo, right? You have to work together. So I think pitching your goal, your objective to internal people will help you in the long run and them. Thanks.
Great. And Kristen, what do you think about this support issue?
Yeah, I think it's twofold. I think you've got to use your internal stakeholders as well as your external stakeholders. They just bring a different perspective. If you get too arrogant on ideas, to Marguerite's point, thinking that you know how to solve all the problems yourself is not the right solution. So you can tap your networks. Not only can they tell you what works, they can also give you insight into what doesn't work, which saves you a lot of time and energy as well. And so banks have been huge partners in Treasury roles. They bring a level of expertise from looking across the customer base, but also within an industry segment, a lot of the consulting firms. And then to Marguerite's point, whether it's the bank business roundtables, organizations like AFP and Team Manny, those are huge opportunities to just pulse each other and get a kind of a relevant view in the industry.
Great. And Seth, what's your sort of view on this support issue here?
You know, it's interesting. I think there's an old adage that says, treat your boss like your customer and treat your customers like they're your boss. And I think that's really applicable here because, you know, in Treasury, so much of what goes on in many treasuries is some form of a shared service. And oftentimes it's, it's part of that corporate headquarters team. And certainly Kristen used that word arrogant. And I think there's a tendency to come off that way. It's like, well, we have policy and these are our systems and this is the way you need to do it. And I think sometimes if you think about it a little bit differently, if those business units and those other departments that you work with weren't there, you would have nothing to do. So to make it more inviting for them, to be able to bounce ideas off of them of things that you're thinking of doing to enhance the services that you're providing to the rest of the business is a slightly different way to go. And I'd say the same thing with your bankers. And your, if you've got a Treasury Workstation, Treasury Management System, treating those organizations as well. I'll use that partner word again. Bring them in, find out what they're doing, what they're seeing and hearing from their customers. It's extraordinarily valuable. Be willing to be that reference. You don't have to love your bank. You don't have to love your vendor. If you like them and yet you're satisfied, put yourself out there, because it'll get you into conversations with other companies where you'll be able to get a pulse on what else is going on out there.
All right, and then I guess the last question here, the whole idea of where do you start? Partnerships and support. So where do you start? Do you try to seek investments in more Treasury resources? You go to your boss and say, hey, I need more people, more technology, more this, more that. Or do you try to show value first and then make a business case for, look, of all the things I've saved? Or so what should we do first? Seth, would you like to take a crack on how you might approach that?
Sure. I have a view that was, very much came out of my old GE days, which was, show value first and take ownership of things and keep working it until it breaks. And when it breaks, it's not necessarily a bad thing that something's broken, but it usually is indicative of either needing technology resources or people resources for your own team. So I'm a big fan of pushing that envelope. And if what you're doing is in fact really valuable and you can back it up by metrics, you're going to get the investment that you need in resources, both technologically and people-wise.
Kristen, what would be your thoughts here?
Completely agree. Yeah, I've never gotten funding by asking for funding without some sort of metric behind it. You show progress, you show value and measurement against whatever you're proposing. Funding tends to just work its way out, right? I know we're all going through a tough time right now, so I'll put COVID aside in that people are, scrutinizing budgets like to the nth degree, but I think in a normal business situation, you always lead with metrics, and that just makes the funding discussion a lot simpler.
And Marguerite, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. You just have to show value first, and then you can move on to investment or people. Thanks.
Okay. Of course, I would agree with that. I think that if you're going to go to your boss and ask for hundreds of thousands of dollars or more people, that the question is, fine, I give you those tomorrow. How do I know they worked? What's my return on my investment, so to speak? And that is something that really you need to build a business case for. And as we see here, building a business case, it depends on the company. Treasury obviously has to work within the culture and the corporate performance metrics. But I think if you look at the second bullet here, companies are saying to themselves at the highest levels about what do we want to do here about operational risks or counterparty risks, and again there could be a second wave out there. So maybe that's a new some sort of threat to our continuity. So and when you try to build a structure that will work, how do you think about this? So this is where we try to look at the actual need for a KPI. As we just explained in the other slide, it's good to show value, but what's the metric here? And the old saying about what gets measured gets managed. And so here we're just throwing up the idea that there are some metrics that you can use. This is by no means complete, and obviously which ones are most important depends on your company and industry. But cash on hand, I think everybody would agree that you want to start with. It's 9 o'clock in the morning. Where in the world's my cash? And And lo and behold, there are treasury management systems that'll certainly do that. But I would challenge a TMS to answer the question about free cash flow, or even how fast I'm getting cash, the cash conversion cycle. So again, these are some metrics. There's a lot of others you can use. Panel, what do you think about these metrics, or just the idea that you should have some at all? Marguerite, let me just start with you.
Sure.
What kind of metrics does Punks use?
Sure. So we do publish the cash conversion cycle monthly. Not that we necessarily have control over all pieces of it, but it's something that we can help monitor, and then we can work with the various departments on their initiatives. Other things that we monitor, that we report on, would even be our, besides like cash liquidity and things like that, would be our bank fees. How much are we paying, and then reconciling to what we provided in our budget. Those are things that we provide as well. And I think that helps provide guidance to, this is showing the value, right? We reduced our bank fees by X, Y, and Z, or, or something. Thanks.
Kristen, what do you think about the idea of metrics, and would you have others that maybe aren't on this list?
Yeah, so I think if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. It's similar to your philosophy, Bruce. So I think, we have, at my current company, we have a set of metrics that we manage for ourselves and we manage for our clients as well. And I think these are key. And then I do think it's important to also tap into the upstream and downstream metrics as well. So super thrilled to hear Marguerite say that she looks at cash conversion cycle. We look at things like automation of payments, right? So if you have, how quickly are you applying your cash, right? And so things like that are also important. The one thing I would caution though is pick a few, right? Pick less than 5 or 10 that are either shared metrics with other process owners, or metrics that you can control in Treasury if you're more in a vertical in Treasury. Because I have seen the opposite happen, where you have so many metrics, you're measuring things and spending a lot of time with the team on things that don't matter and can't impact your business, right?
Well, that's a good point. Seth, your sort of perspective on metrics and Treasury and how it measures success?
I think it's critical that you have to have a couple of manageable metrics that are there. You can't just assume that because you've selected, let's say you've selected 3 KPIs that you're working with regularly, doesn't mean that they're fixed forever for the next 3 or 5 years. You may be changing what your KPIs are on 6 months based on the projects you're working on and what's most important to your company and to Treasury. I'll tell you that from a bank perspective, the one that we tend to focus on the most with and for our customers is that cash conversion cycle, because frankly we bring tools, all the banks bring tools to really be able to positively affect DSO and DPO, as far as integrating and automating the payables and receivable sides of things. So a lot of focus for us there. And the other thing I'd point out is cash on hand. I mean, that was huge when the financial crisis hit in 2008, and it became a risk question as well. It was not only how much cash, but where is it? What bank is it with? What's their credit rating? And starting to evaluate some of that. But there's also another aspect, which is of the cash that's out there and the cash that's on the balance sheet. How much of that do you actually have regular, if not real-time data to, because very few organizations have real-time data at this point, but do you have daily, do you have weekly numbers to identify what percentage of the cash is actually reflected on the balance sheet? So perhaps that's a different spin on cash on hand. It's cash that we know where it is and on a very regular basis. So there's some great things here, but a lot of the metrics we have displayed depends on which part of Treasury you're in. And, as you get to the larger enterprises, you could have departments that are focused on capital markets and have some of these that are much more relevant to that particular part of Treasury.
Well, I think that's a good point. I remember back in the 2008 crisis, the idea that Bear Stearns had, I don't know, $18 billion of cash on the balance sheet. So, gee, look, $18 billion. The question really is, in relation to what? If I have $18 billion, is that good or bad? Without some relative feature or knowing when I'm going to get more cash. So if your cash conversion cycle is very short, you know you're going to get cash tomorrow, that's good. But if I have $18 billion of cash and $100 billion in current liabilities, maybe not so good. It depends. I mean, I'm not going to say what the numbers should be, so it is relative there. So the idea of targets, I think, is important. Targets that mean something to you, your industry, and quite frankly, whether it's better or worse than your competitors. So again, the market does count here. So let's move on to see, and in fact, let's take the opportunity here to talk about building this business case for change. And this could be just a clever way of looking at the complexity of today's companies. Obviously, this is a very simple chart here, and what we're trying to do here is give you the idea that there are partners across the top, and there are savings that you could look at. The green ones are relatively easy to measure, and the yellow ones, or orange or ochre, I guess is that color, more difficult to measure. But that shouldn't stop you from trying to estimate what those benefits are across the entire company, not just the Treasury column, but accounting, FP&A, tax, audit, and of course the business units, which are the real source of your operating cash flows. And what you're going to find is that there are relationships. The business units are out there busy making widgets and selling widgets, and to the extent that they are a net user of cash or a net generator of cash, they affect the borrowing utilization and maybe even your foreign exchange exposure, since they're out there selling in Thai baht or Cambodian currencies or some other exotics. And again, these are weaker currencies, and so therefore the P&L impact is going to be worth less when you translate back to stronger dollars. So again, all things to consider when you're trying to build a chart here. And again, how do some of these yellow colored things affect your success? Difficult to say. I mean, operating risk, really in the eye of the beholder. But let's get on to the final poll that we have here, because we talked about metrics. Now I'd like to ask the audience about how they or their companies sort of measure Treasury's success. So let me put out this poll, and I'd appreciate it all if you could vote on this. Because again, I think this is an indication of where you want to put your resources. So does Treasury measure success by its contribution to a variety of intercompany goals, cash flow targets, borrowings, exposure, or quite frankly, and as we've discussed before, maybe there's some other metrics here that we just can't show. I mean, I can't have a laundry list that goes on and on. I think Seth's point was well taken, which is let's find out the whatever it is, 1, 2, or 3 that are important. And so maybe to you, these metrics are not important. Okay, a few more seconds here. And let me close this in 3, 2, 1, and closing. And I'm going to share the results here. So, and I'm going to ask the panel here, I think I'm going to start with Marguerite. What do you think about these poll results?
Sure. So just to go through this quickly due to the interest of time, I think all of them are relevant above, and everything that we've discussed. And I think there's many other things that can be measured and communicated to show the value of the Treasury team. So in summary, I'm not surprised to see pretty much like an even spread across these. Thanks.
Kristen, what do you think?
Yes, very similar. I'm not surprised. I think cash flow is at the heart of what people focus on, but that's balanced with your exposure to markets, your borrowings, and your intercompany. So this would be as I expected.
And Seth, your thoughts?
Yeah, cash is king, and more now than ever because you know there's a lot of business constraints in the environment we're operating in, and no surprise with that being the top of the top of this mountain.
Yeah, I think my takeaway here is that the impact on borrowings and the contribution to intercompany goals are interesting. I think are related, but there is sort of a differential between the importance of these things. Certainly would not argue with the idea of cash flow. The only good news and bad news, I think, as it was said before, Treasury doesn't really have that much control over operating cash flow when it comes to sales or obviously AR or AP, and yet cash flow targets are important. I think there's an implication there that this has got to flow from Treasury back out to the business units, and again, that partnership is, I think, one of the real challenges that Treasury is going to face. All right, let's hide that one, and we got to move on here. We are running a little behind. So again, we're going to talk about making it happen here, and I want to just put this list up here quickly about how you could create the conditions to recognize some of the benefits we've talked about before. And quite frankly, number one, I think, is create partnerships. Treasury just can't do it by itself. This is not slip me the numbers under the door, I'll slip you the answers back out under the door. You have to get out and talk to people, people inside the company, outside the company. So I'm not going to address these per se here. I think we've talked about some of the importance of these items here. And again, here are some more here. And again, I think one of the things we didn't talk enough about was the fact that you might need some changes in HR policies. Again, Treasury might find that difficult to do on its own, so that gets back to the Treasury issue. Thoughts from the panel about the items that we've had on this slide or the previous one? I'll just leave it open to anybody who wants to speak.
I'll take it. It's sort of.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Kristen.
I was just going to emphasize again the HR side. I speak to a lot of folks in the industry, and it is a tough time. So we are all being asked to do more than what we normally do in an environment that we're not used to. And a lot of us are in extenuating circumstances. I think of some of the folks that are dual working families trying to watch little kids or care for elderly, and I think just a little bit of understanding of that for everybody goes a long way. So I know every company has HR policies, but I can't suggest enough that people just pulse their peers and colleagues in the industry, make sure people are doing okay, right?
Other thoughts from yeah, go ahead.
I think it's a real important part if you are part of your company's leadership. You know, these are the times when leaders are made, and it's real important to, you know, do those pulse checks on your people and, you know, make sure they're okay. And because everyone is remote, or most people are remote now, it may be a lot harder for you to do that, but it's ever more important to do that. Second thing I would take away is once you're done stabilizing day-to-day operations, there's opportunities here. There are things that you are going to have seen in the last several months, and will continue to see until we're done with all of this, that create huge opportunities for you, your treasury, and your company. Seize those opportunities. It may be hard to get the plans in place, but now's the time to look at it, ideate around it, and plan for what you're going to do next. And it may be very different from what you thought was going to be next 3 months ago. So huge opportunities for everybody.
Yeah, I would add that one of the issues that I think needs to be considered is the whole idea of liquidity metrics as, quite frankly, a bonusable event. Business units are rewarded for EBITDA, they're rewarded for market share, sales growth. How many business units are actually rewarded for generating cash? It's not free. Even in today's world with interest rates being low, as we've seen before, if you're out of cash or you don't have any borrowing capacity left, the price is infinite. So how do you reward or penalize a business unit for being a source or use of cash? I think you have to embed that into the corporate goals. Which metric should it be? I'm going to leave that one alone. But no metric, I don't think, is the right answer if Treasury is going to really form a partnership with the rest of the units in the company. I think that ends the formal presentation part here. We do have some questions. I realize that we are sort of past our time. So I understand if people have to get back to work or if they have other commitments. So if you want to drop off, please do so. For those that want to stay on, hopefully, panel, do you have about another 5 or 10 minutes?
Yeah, I'm good.
Sure.
Okay, that's good. So let's try to, maybe we'll take a few questions here in the next 5 or 10 minutes, and then I realize that we're going to have to go. So here's the question: if you happen to be an organization that has more cash than normal, but you need to keep it fully liquid, what's the best way to keep that extra cash safe?
I can take this one. So at my company, we've been opening up some savings accounts with the banks. So literally, we're just putting the cash on the bank balance sheet. And we've been following our investment policy. Okay, step number 1, investment policy. And our policy says that we can do that. That's been giving us a better rate of return. And then we have our government money market funds that we've been using too. All of it's super liquid because we're not sure how quickly we want to use the funds to pay things back or, you know, in the emergency. So things like that we've been doing.
Okay, here's another question. What are your thoughts for companies that indicated they weren't prepared? How do they survive without appropriate procedures and technologies? Any thoughts about that?
Well, I think this is a wake-up call. Number one, you know, obviously, first order of business is stabilize what you need to do on a day-to-day basis. But as part of that, you know, once you've gotten to sort of an equilibrium point, it's time to look at how you're prepared, because these kinds of events, they don't happen every day, but, you know, there's uncertainty out there. And, you know, number one, we don't know how long this is all going to last. And we may, you know, I don't want to be a prognosticator here of where this pandemic goes. But certainly, you know, there is, you know, it may, we may see things opening back up. We may see additional waves of this happening in the fall. So the question is, if you get to a point where you get back to a little bit of what used to be, you know, how do you prepare for the next thing? I mean, it may not be the, you know, a resurgence of COVID-19. It could be something else that happens. I mean, if you think about the kinds of events that happen, whether it was, you know, Hurricane Superstorm Sandy, whether it's the, you know, a number of years ago there was a major hit to the electric grid in the Northeast, any number of things that can happen. Those things can both happen when we're back to normal, or if this is the normal for a while. How do you deal with yet another thing on top of some of the circumstances? So you really have to look at what's gone on here and take stock of it, do some postmortems, as I like to say, and then figure out what you need to do to move forward.
And I would just add to what Seth said, you know, for those that were like completely unprepared, start basic, right? I think the panelists all talked prior, like start with documenting SOPs, right? And then talk through the scenarios. Like document where your SOPs are stored. Think about critical users, non-critical users. You know, what would you do if a system wasn't available, right? And so it doesn't have to be, I think all of us agree, it doesn't have to be this like massive exercise. You can build it in maturity in your BCP, but to Seth's point, like start basic, start simple, and then start thinking of the different scenarios that might happen and how they might impact your processes, whether you're in the current situation or your traditional working situation, right?
And with
Great.
14% of the audience being, with 14% of the audience being foundational in their treasury, I think there's lots of opportunities there. Really take baby steps. It's okay. That'll lead to greater and bigger steps.
Exactly.
I think we're going to take one last question, and then we're going to fold our tents and go away for now. And of course, we could come back a little later on. I suspect that the answers to the questions we've raised today are not going to be answered all in an hour and 15 minutes. So there will be more surprises in the future. But in relation to an issue that we did bring up, here's a question. What additional measures are recommended to deploy in regard to the lack of historical information and fraud risk?
I can take a piece of that, and then maybe if you guys want to comment too. I think just on the historical data, I think Seth hit on it earlier. In some cases, you might have to create data to actually create a scenario, right? And so a lot of that, unfortunately, has to be done manually, but we have seen that with others. And then on the security or fraud side, I think basics, again, issuing policies. Is your wireless secure and connected? Do you have Alexa listening devices in the room with you when you're on confidential calls talking about M&A activity? I mean, each company, you can kind of Google the web, or we can come back with some tidbits in a follow-up, but you know, some of those basic work from home policies and stuff just need to be sent out so that people have an awareness for their work environment and the new norm.
No, I agree.
I think also in this environment, don't be afraid to, you know, ask tough questions and confirm that what you're being asked to do. I mean, the classic case, you get an email from your company's CEO or CFO telling you to move money. Did that really come from them, or has your company's email system been hacked? You know, if you see people acting in a way that is contrary to how they've normally acted, chances are something's up with that. So don't be afraid to question and call back the person that's asking you by email or maybe by a text message to do something that's out of the norm. You know, I certainly talked about this before. The fraud is way up. I saw one study, I think that in the last 4 weeks, it's like 600 to 700% increase in fraud attempts. So be vigilant, and you know, certainly any you know, when it comes to money movement, any payment that you're doing to somebody for the first time should be reconfirmed. Any change in payment instructions for a vendor should be reconfirmed. So need to be really smart about it.
I think that last one's a good. The business email compromise issues, I know the AFP has done studies on that, but I would only point out one maybe semi-obvious fact, that if you get a phony email from someone who claims to be the CEO, you can bet your bottom dollar that there's only one thing that is accurate in that email, which is going to be the bank account number that you're supposed to send the money to. So to Seth's point, if that bank account number is not the same as what you've been dealing with, or it's a brand new one that you've never seen before, bells ought to go off about, why are we sending $100,000 to the Philippines at midnight? And I'm not supposed to tell anyone? That's weird. And don't be afraid to speak. Absolutely. Okay, with that, I think we're going to have to close down. I know people have other things they need to do today. I'm very appreciative of the audience, and thank you, panelists, for the great effort in answering all these questions. And As you see, don't forget to take a look at FENG or T-Mani. I think as it was said before, Marguerite had a very good point. If you really want to stay up to date with all the latest and greatest, you should talk to other people who have been there and done that, and you're going to find them in FENG, you're going to find them in T-Mani. So that's my 5-second commercial. Panelists, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce.
Audience, thank you. And audience, thank you. And we will talk again very soon. So I'm now ending the webinar.